The year is 1942. In the shimmering heat of the Pacific Islands, thousands of young men from the United States Marine Corps poured ashore, sharp, lean, and unyielding. They stepped into a world unlike any battlefield they had trained for, dense jungles crawling with green, air so humid it felt like you carried water on your skin, visibility shrinking to little more than a few dozen yards. The undergrowth swallowed sights and sounds alike. Each rustle, every drip of rain, every flicker of movement meant danger. The terrain forced combat into weird, brutal apocalypses of bush and vine, where engagements often happened at ranges of less than 30 yards. In those jungle theaters, one weapon that would challenge every assumption the Japanese forces held about modern warfare surfaced: the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Unexpected, ferocious, and in its own wild way, symbolic. The fact that the Japanese military doctrine had never seriously considered shotguns as implements of war would become a glaring oversight. The wilderness of the Pacific made every mistake more costly. Japan had for decades prepared for war: heavy drilling, mountains of training manuals, rifles, machine guns, mortars, submachine guns. British rifles, American machine guns, French mortars, Soviet designs, they all got attention. But shotguns? Tools for hunting birds or clearing brush, perhaps. Never war. Yet the Marines brought thousands of versions into the Pacific Campaign, approximately 25,000 Winchester Model 1897s and between 60,000 to 80,000 Winchester Model 1912s. The sheer number was a statement: American industrial might meeting jungle cunning. The Japanese could not match the steel, the logistics, the factories, but they believed they could match the spirit. Their philosophy rested on something the Japanese called spiritual power, unwavering will and hand-to-hand readiness, intended to overcome material disadvantages. Japan's steel production in a given year was less than what America could crank out in a month. Their answer was superior training, better close combat, night infiltration attacks followed by rifle and bayonet in darkness. That doctrine worked for them in China, in Malaya, in earlier Philippine campaigns. But in the choking vegetation of the Solomons or the New Guinea Hills, a Marine with a slide-action shotgun upset that calculus. Imagine the scene: a patrol creeping through green twilight, vines clutching ankles, humidity pressing down like a second skin. Guards post, the point man grips a short-barreled pump gun instead of just a Garand or carbine. Why? Because at 10 yards or less, the shotgun's burst of buckshot could light up the jungle like a lightning strike. It didn't require precision in tangled undergrowth. When you can't see 30 yards ahead, you bet on spread, on brute effect. The Japanese, trained that close-in combat meant rifle butt, bayonet, decisive hand-to-hand engagement, they weren't ready for pellets splaying like a bloom of steel shards. But this weapon of surprise had its caveats: logistics, environment, terrain, doctrine. Despite the dramatic arrival, the jungle had its own rules. The very closeness of the fights, the shifting shadow and leaf cover, the moist air, all these conspired to make even a benign-looking shotgun behave unpredictably. Ammunition. Bulky. Shells. Paper husk then, vulnerable to humidity. Jungle moisture didn't forgive paper hulls that absorbed water, swelled, jammed chambers. Ammunition failures turned tactical advantage into frustration. Yet the idea remained compelling: a weapon built for the wild, deployed in the wild, offering a raw edge. In those first months of the Pacific Campaign, as the Marines landed and fought, one of the less-seen stories quietly unfolded: the meeting of machinery and madness among Island Green and Salt Spray. It wasn't just another rifle in the pack, it was a shotgun that forced doctrine to shift, however reluctantly. The jungle didn't care about army doctrine, environment rewrote rules. The Marines, wild-eyed and determined, adapted. The Japanese, trained for a kind of war, found themselves fighting unfamiliar angles. In that crucible the shotgun stood as both tool and symbol, American pragmatism in a setting of horror and vines. And so the stage is set. The Japanese doctrine, well-honed but incomplete. The Marines with their unconventional weapons suddenly in the field. The jungle waiting to settle scores. What follows isn't just a story of a weapon, it's a story of adaptation, surprise, and the raw guts of combat where rules are rewritten by mud and leaf. By 1942, both sides of the Pacific were fighting two different wars, one on paper, and one in the mud. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent years perfecting doctrine. Every recruit drilled until his body moved like a weapon, precision rifle fire, bayonet charges, night infiltration, spiritual fortitude. Japan's leaders believed that willpower could substitute for steel. Their factories couldn't rival American output, so their answer was discipline, turn every soldier into a blade sharper than industrial metal. That faith worked in places like China and Malaya, where terrain and surprise favored the attacker. But in the Pacific, it met something new, a weapon born from duck hunts and police work, the 12-gauge shotgun. To Japanese planners, it wasn't even a real, combat arm. Their manuals dissected Western rifles and machine guns down to the screw, but never mentioned the idea of a close-range, multi-pellet burst shredding through jungle vines. Meanwhile, the United States was doing what it did best, throwing machines at problems. Factories back home were spitting out firearms faster than armies could use them. Among them were tens of thousands of shotguns, rugged Winchester Model 1897s and sleeker Model 1912s. Both had pump actions that could cycle faster than most bolt rifles, and at point-blank range they could erase a man before he ever saw the muzzle flash. The Japanese weren't ready for that kind of fight. Their tactics assumed the enemy would rely on rifles, long, slow, and easy to disrupt in ambushes or banzai charges. But the shotgun flipped the script. Suddenly, that dark, tangled space where the Japanese soldier felt strongest, the 10 yards between him and his opponent, belonged to the Americans. Each side's philosophy shaped how they fought. The Japanese prized the bayonet charge, the cry of banzai, the single clean kill. The Marines didn't care about elegance. They cared about survival. If a weapon worked in a jungle where you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, it was worth carrying. Still, the shotgun wasn't magic. It didn't rewrite the war. The Japanese doctrine of close combat dominance didn't vanish overnight. The weapon was too specialized, its range too short, its shells too heavy. But in those few brutal seconds where ambush met reaction, the pump gun ruled. It shattered assumptions and forced both sides to think differently about how to fight in the green hell of the Pacific. Doctrine was supposed to shape battle. In the Pacific, the battle shaped everything else. The shotgun wasn't elegant. It didn't whisper or snipe. It roared, an ugly, wide-mouthed burst that turned the quiet jungle into chaos. To understand why it earned both fascination and frustration among Marines, you've got to look at the machine itself. The Winchester Model 1897, designed by John Browning back when Teddy Roosevelt still carried a cavalry saber, was basically a hunter's gun that refused to retire. It had an external hammer and, more importantly, no trigger disconnect, meaning a Marine could hold the trigger down and just keep pumping. Every cycle fired another shell as fast as his arm could move. That slam fire trick wasn't a design accident, it made the M1897 the closest thing to a handheld shotgun machine gun. Then came the Model 1912, sleeker and internal hammered, the kind of refinement that made armorers smile and grunts swear less when cleaning it. It lost the external hammer but kept the reliability and slam fire capability. Both guns could unload 6 or 7 shells in a few seconds, each shell spewing 9 pellets of double-aught buckshot. At 30 feet, that spread turned the space between tree trunks into a blender. In the Pacific jungle, that mattered. Combat there didn't follow the geometry of Europe's open fields. Visibility dropped to meters, sometimes less. The air was thick, hot, and deceptive, every leaf a curtain, every shadow a hiding place. A rifle was fine for 300 yards, a shotgun was made for 10. When the Japanese liked to crawl close, slip past sentries, or erupt from tree lines, a shotgun spread could erase that advantage. No need to aim precisely. Just point, pump, and the green haze bloomed with sound and metal. But the shotgun also brought headaches. Those paper-hulled shells, standard U.S. issue early in the war, soaked up jungle humidity like sponges. Marines learned quickly that swollen shells jammed actions, or worse, split open mid-load. Tropical rain didn't care about ordnance design. Later, brass-cased shells appeared, solving much of that problem, but not before plenty of frustrated gunners cursed the soggy Pacific air. Weight was another issue. 12-gauge ammo was bulky, heavier than rifle cartridges, and didn't fit neatly into standard ammo belts. A man could carry more Garand clips than shotgun shells for the same weight, which mattered on multi-day jungle patrols. And the range? A shotgun slug could reach out to maybe 75 yards if you were lucky and the target was big. Beyond that, it was just wishful thinking. Still, Marines loved what it could do up close. In thick underbrush, on night watches, or in village clearings, the weapon's brutal simplicity felt almost poetic. One pull of the trigger was a wall of force, instant, unambiguous. It was a weapon built for the environment, even if the environment hated it. Every time a shotgun went off in the Pacific, it marked a moment where modern technology met primal fear. One side brought doctrine and discipline, the other brought a pump gun designed for pheasants. And in that absurd meeting of purpose, the shotgun proved that sometimes, the best weapon in war isn't the most advanced, it's the one that fits the chaos you're stuck in. Guadalcanal, 1942. The place looked like paradise until you actually stepped onto it. Rotting jungle, chest-deep mud, heat that boiled sweat right into your uniform. The Marines called it, the Green Hell, and they weren't exaggerating. When the first waves hit the beaches, most of them carried rifles, the M1 Garand or Springfield 1903. But scattered among them were men with stubby, battered pump guns slung under their arms. Nobody had written doctrine for how to use them. They were just there, experimental tools in an environment that chewed up plans and spat them out. Early reports from the Battle of Guadalcanal tell the story less through paperwork and more through tone, short, grim field notes that describe ambushes so close you could smell the enemy's sweat. Patrols vanished into jungle corridors and came back hours later, bleeding, haunted, and sometimes with their shotguns wrapped in mud. At those distances, rifles were clumsy. Bayonets tangled in vines. But a shotgun? One pump, one pull, and the world cleared out. Marines posted along perimeters learned to love them during night watch. The Japanese liked to infiltrate under cover of darkness, crawling close, cutting throats before anyone could raise an alarm. Against that kind of attack, the shotgun was king. Its bark was short, sharp, and final. Buckshot didn't miss much at 10 yards. There are fragments from diaries and oral histories, small details that don't make official archives. A Marine in Company L mentions firing at shadows near the Lunga perimeter and seeing the whole tree line explode. Another recalls a shotgunner blasting a charging soldier clean off a trail. They didn't use flowery language, they just called it close work. But nothing in Guadalcanal came easy. The same humidity that rotted boots also turned shotgun shells into mush. The early issue ammunition had paper hulls, and when the rain came, and it always came, those shells swelled until they jammed chambers solid. Marines tried everything, wrapping shells in oilcloth, keeping them in waterproof tins, drying them over small fires. Nothing lasted long. You either kept shooting or you didn't shoot at all. Still, even with all that, the shotgun carved out a niche. In a war fought on open beaches and endless ridges, it found a home in the blind alleys of the jungle. Marines began assigning them deliberately, to scouts, to point men, to guards who couldn't afford a miss. No one thought of it as glamorous. It was just another way to survive. After Guadalcanal, the reports that filtered back to Washington weren't loud or triumphant. They simply noted the weapon's limited but effective performance in short-range engagements. In other words, it worked when it mattered most. By the time the Marines left the island, the pump gun had earned its reputation, not as a miracle weapon, but as something more honest. It was the gun you reached for when things got too close, too fast, and too ugly for anything else. And that would become the story of the shotgun throughout the Pacific, a weapon without doctrine, carried by men who didn't care about doctrine, in a place where survival was the only rule that mattered. New Guinea, 1943. If Guadalcanal was a nightmare, New Guinea was the sequel, swampier, wetter, and twice as unforgiving. The place didn't just fight you, it ate your gear alive. Boots rotted in a week. Rifles jammed from mold. Food spoiled before noon. And somewhere between the monsoon rains and the mosquito swarms, the American shotgun tried to prove it still belonged on the front line. The New Guinea campaign dragged on for years, 1942 to 1945, an endless churn of mountain ridges, jungle valleys, and suffocating humidity. U.S. and Australian troops fought through terrain that defied every tactical textbook written in Washington. The shotgun seemed perfect for such conditions: close-range ambushes, tight patrol trails, sudden face-to-face firefights. On paper, it should have thrived. In practice, the jungle laughed at it. Paper-hulled shells, again, were the enemy. The rain came sideways, from above and below. Every puddle was a swamp of bacteria and rust. Marines and soldiers reported that shells would swell inside their belts until they looked like rotten fruit, useless, jam-prone, sometimes splitting inside the chamber. A man could clean his shotgun in the morning and still find it corroded by dusk. Then came logistics, the quiet killer of enthusiasm. 12-gauge shells didn't pack well. They didn't fit in standard ammo belts, and resupply units hated dealing with them. Rifle ammo came in neat clips and boxes, shotgun shells came in odd cardboard cartons that fell apart in moisture. The brass-cased versions, the long-promised fix, were still months away. So while the weapon's idea made sense, keeping it fed was a nightmare. Still, there were moments when the shotgun earned its keep. Patrols in the Markham Valley used them for close-quarter jungle fighting, clearing huts, or flushing out snipers. Scouts favored them for ambushes, where one burst of buckshot could end a fight before it started. In those moments, doctrine didn't matter. It was raw reaction time versus the terrain. But compared to Guadalcanal, the shotgun's presence in New Guinea was quieter, less iconic, more improvised. Reports from field officers began to sound weary, almost apologetic, effective at close range, but unsuitable for extended operations due to ammunition limitations. Translation: it worked, but the jungle didn't care. The Japanese learned quickly, too. By 1943 they'd adjusted their infiltration tactics, favoring longer approaches, camouflage, and small unit ambushes where distance mattered again. The Marines' shotgun advantage shrank as the enemy got smarter. What had once been a shock weapon was now a niche tool for the few who could keep it running. Yet even as its practicality waned, the shotgun carried an aura, a symbol of the Marines' ability to adapt. It wasn't the glamorous hero of the campaign, but it was a survivor's weapon. The kind of tool you carried not because it was perfect, but because you knew, sooner or later, the jungle was going to shove someone in your face. By the end of the New Guinea fighting, the shotgun's reputation was solid but realistic. It was no miracle, no secret weapon of the Pacific. It was just brutally honest, a gun that told the truth about close-range combat. And in a world of mud, fever, and rain, sometimes that truth was all you needed to stay alive. By late 1944, the U.S. Marines had stopped treating the shotgun like an oddity and started treating it like a tool, one meant for very specific, very dirty jobs. Jungle combat had taught them that nothing universal survived long out there. Every weapon had a niche, and the shotgun's niche was simple: the point man's weapon, the guard's comfort, the last word in close quarters. No one issued a grand new doctrine from Washington. The adaptation happened on the ground, where things always do. Units wrote their own field notes: shotgun for point patrol, shotgun for night watch, shotgun for mopping operations. The phrasing varied, but the meaning didn't. The pump gun was now a problem solver, too heavy and short-ranged for open field use, but devastating in the cramped hell of a bunker or village clearing. Marines began building small, unofficial tactics around it. A patrol's point man often carried a shotgun, his job to meet the first contact and survive the first 5 seconds. Behind him came riflemen, ready to back him up with longer fire. The same logic applied to night defense. When Japanese infiltration teams tried to slip past perimeter lines, the Marines stationed shotgunners at the most likely approach paths. 10 yards of jungle, a sudden rustle, one pump, one flash, problem solved. Inside defensive positions, shotguns guarded command posts, ammo dumps, and prisoners. They became the weapon of certainty, the gun you used when you couldn't afford to miss. It wasn't glamorous, but it was comforting. Marines joked that the sound of a shell racking in the dark could make the jungle go quiet. There were also the urban or semi-urban battles, the Philippines, Tarawa, Paliliu, later Manila, where fighting moved into villages, airfields, and ruined bunkers. There, the shotgun suddenly felt made for the job. Clearing rooms, tunnels, or narrow corridors didn't require a 300-yard rifle. It required something brutal and immediate. A pump gun with buckshot was both. Still, the limitations refused to disappear. The gun's 7-shot magazine ran dry fast, and in a firefight, reloading was painfully slow compared to an M1 Garand. It spread, while forgiving at close range, was useless beyond 40 yards. And its ammo, still heavier than rifle rounds, kept limiting how long a man could carry it before he started cursing it. But it did something that other weapons couldn't: it gave Marines psychological control over the unknown. In the pitch-black night, when the world shrank to noises and nerves, a shotgun wasn't just a weapon, it was reassurance in steel. You didn't need to see to hit something. You just needed to hear where it was. The Japanese learned to fear that sound. Accounts from surviving soldiers describe a repeating gun that fired like thunder, a weapon that made short work of assault teams trying to breach American lines. They had no real counter to it. Bayonet drills and silent charges didn't mean much against 9 pellets hitting like a wall. By the end of 1944, the shotgun had gone from curiosity to quiet legend among those who actually used it. Not a war winner, not a myth, but a survivor's companion. The kind of weapon that, like the men who carried it, didn't care about glory. It cared about getting out of the jungle alive. By early 1945, the shotgun had found its final, most brutal test, the Pacific Islands that refused to surrender. Iwo Jima. Okinawa. Names that still sound like exhaustion. The kind of battles where the difference between living and dying came down to who rounded the corner first. The terrain was no longer a jungle in the romantic sense. It was blasted rock, ash, and coral, tunnels dug deep into volcanic ground, dark chambers full of smoke and screaming. Rifles still ruled the ridgelines, but once the Marines or soldiers went underground, those long, elegant weapons became useless. The tunnels twisted tight, corners came fast, and the air turned into dust. That's where the shotgun stepped up again. In the cave-clearing teams, a shotgunner often led the way, his weapon loaded with .00 buckshot, sometimes alternating with slugs. He didn't move fast, he moved sure. Behind him came flamethrowers, demolition men, and sometimes a second shotgunner. The tactic was as crude as it was effective: blast, burn, and bury. The shotgun's role wasn't glamorous, but it was personal. Every pull of the trigger was a face-to-face decision. There were no long shots here, no abstract enemies on a ridge 100 yards away. Every fight was close enough to smell. The men who carried shotguns into those tunnels came out changed, or didn't come out at all. Some of the after-action reports from Okinawa read like something out of a nightmare. One Marine unit logged the use of shotguns in over 30 separate cave assaults in a single week. They noted that effectiveness in confined areas remains unmatched. No exaggeration there. Inside those spaces, the blast wave alone could kill. But there was something else, too: fatigue. The shotgun was the perfect tool for clearing an enemy hideout, but the emotional toll on the men using it was heavy. Killing at point-blank range strips away any illusion of distance or duty. You weren't a soldier fighting an army, you were a man confronting another man in the dark. Many veterans later refused to talk about it. Some destroyed their shotguns before shipping home. By this stage of the war, the shotgun wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of how far the Pacific fighting had descended into raw survival. No tactics manuals, no parade drills. Just instinct and muscle memory. In those caves, the shotgun represented something stripped down to its core, the will to end a fight before it ended you. When the last caves on Okinawa fell silent, the men who had carried those guns knew exactly what they'd been part of. They weren't thinking about history or strategy. They were thinking about breathing, about making it back to sunlight. And yet, when they did, they left behind a legacy written not in medals or speeches, but in the unspoken truth of every Marine who survived. Sometimes the simplest weapon, the oldest, was the one that carried you through hell. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the war was over, but the shotgun story wasn't. It had slipped through the entire Pacific campaign like a quiet ghost, showing up where other weapons failed, then fading back into the shadows when the big guns got credit. Nobody wrote victory speeches about it, yet every veteran who'd used one knew its worth. In the months after VJ Day, armories across the Pacific filled with rusted, pitted weapons waiting to be shipped home or scrapped. M1 Garans, Bars, Thompsons, and a surprising number of Winchester and Ithaca pump shotguns, still caked with volcanic dust. Most of them never made it into museums. They were tools, not trophies. The war had burned through their metal and their meaning. But the lesson stayed. In the jungle and the caves, the military had relearned something ancient, that close-quarters fighting never really disappears. The shotgun's raw, mechanical simplicity had made it indispensable. When the next wars came, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the weapon quietly returned, barely changed. The world moved into jet-age combat, yet the pump action remained. There's irony in that. Historians later tried to categorize its specific role with fancy terms like close combat deterrent or area suppression device. The truth was blunter. It was the weapon of certainty in chaos. It did one thing, perfectly, at ranges where nothing else mattered. And for all the talk of progress, no amount of technology ever fully replaced that kind of reliability. Somewhere in a rusting crate, an old trench gun still carries the marks of coral dust and salt air. Its barrel is scarred, its stock cracked, but the action still pumps smooth. It's a relic of a time when men fought wars face to face, not through screens or satellites. If the Pacific War proved anything, it's that the oldest weapons endure for a reason. In a world obsessed with precision, the shotgun was a reminder of something brutally human. When everything collapses into noise and smoke, sometimes you don't need accuracy, you need finality. By 1946, the Army and Marine Corps were back home, and so were a lot of their shotguns, cleaned, reblued, some even sawn off and handed down to farmers, hunters, or cops. The same gun that cleared bunkers in Okinawa now guarded gas stations in Kansas. That's how American weapons age. They don't retire, they just change jobs. The military, meanwhile, tried to turn the Pacific lessons into doctrine. Reports from ordnance officers called for limited continuation of combat shotgun procurement. That's bureaucrat talk for, keep a few handy, just in case the next jungle doesn't respect rifle range. And sure enough, a few years later in Korea, they pulled the old pump guns out of storage again, same pattern, same ammo, same story. But there was a cultural shift, too. The Pacific veterans carried the shotgun's memory into civilian life. Hunters swore by it, police departments adopted it, Hollywood turned it into a symbol of authority. The same metallic chick-chuck sound that froze Japanese infiltrators in the jungle now became shorthand for power in every American action movie. Funny, isn't it? A tool born from fear and survival turned into pop culture's favorite sound effect. In military circles, the shotgun stayed niche but respected. It never got the love the M1 did, or the mystique of the Thompson, but it didn't need to. It was too practical to die, too crude to mythologize. A weapon like that doesn't care what anyone thinks, it just works. And if you looked closely at post-war photos, training ranges, Marine barracks, police drills, you could still spot it. The old 12-gauge, still in service, still pumping, still refusing to fade. A quiet survivor in a world that kept pretending warfare had become modern. Some historians later said the Pacific War made the shotgun obsolete. They were wrong. What it really did was prove the opposite, that no matter how advanced a battlefield becomes, there will always be moments when a man has to fight another man at breathing distance. And in that moment, all the fancy rifles, all the polished doctrines, all the talk about precision and progress go out the window. You fall back on instinct, grit, and whatever you can trust not to jam. For thousands of Marines and soldiers, that trust had a name, and it wasn't innovation. It was the simple, stubborn rhythm of a pump-action shotgun. The war ended, the maps were redrawn, and the Pacific fell silent. But in that silence, the shotgun remained, quiet proof that some weapons outlive the wars they're built for. It was never the star of any victory parade, never the subject of propaganda reels or recruiting posters. It didn't need to be. Its history was written not in speeches, but in 10-yard bursts of chaos where survival beat strategy every time. When people talk about the Pacific War now, they talk about aircraft carriers, atomic bombs, and generals with steel gazes. They forget the things that made the war workable for the men inside it, the mundane tools that bridged the gap between theory and blood. The shotgun was one of those things. Crude, yes. Unrefined, sure. But when you're crawling through a black tunnel with one hand on a flashlight and the other on a trigger, refinement stops mattering. It became a symbol of the Pacific in miniature, close, relentless, personal. Every shot a decision, every engagement a reminder that technology can't sterilize killing. The shotgun stripped combat back to its core, a contest of nerve, not range. After the war, it slipped back into American life almost unnoticed. The same Winchester that shattered a cave bunker found a second life in a sheriff's car. The Ithaca that guarded a night perimeter in Peleliu became a duck gun in Louisiana. Tools of war reabsorbed into peace. The country moved on, the weapon didn't need to. It had already proven everything it ever needed to prove. If you were to sum up its legacy in one line, it might sound something like this: the shotgun never won the Pacific, but it made sure a lot of Americans survived it. And maybe that's the truest measure of a weapon's worth. Not the glory it earns, but the quiet, ugly work it does so someone else can see the next sunrise. The Pacific was full of myths, planes, ships, bombs, but somewhere between the trees, the mud, and the tunnels, a pump-action 12-gauge wrote its own kind of legend. One that didn't ask to be remembered. It just was.